Mr. Rivera, how are we doing on this fine day? Thomas Jockin, Tyler, Michael, everyone doing all right? How are we doing? Oh, look at Michael. He's outside again. It's so pretty. Tyler, good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. It's a
Good to see
treat.
you.
Oh, it's good to see you. Tyler, it's always a delight. I hope everyone is well. It is freaking cold in Virginia, but our pipes have not frozen, so I'm quite thrilled about that. We still have copper pipes, which are known to are freeze in these kind of temperatures. But so far so good. You do the same. By the way, it never occurred to me years ago to drip the pipes all night. I used to like get up every hour and run them because I'm an idiot. But if you just drip them a little bit, it actually makes a huge difference. Because last year well, actually 2 years ago they busted a lot of them. But that's when we lost electricity and it got to like 0 degrees for 5 days. It was stupid. But anything, we're doing well. Gentlemen, I'd be curious what anyone is thinking. I've been reading about the CIA and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is like one of the most fascinating historical episodes ever. I've been on that and then trying to finish The Map is Indestructible with the distinction between being critical and critical thinking. So those are my thoughts. But I'd be curious what anyone is thinking about absolutely anything. Oh, the artist is at work.
Well,
Oh, look at that guy. Oh, it's beautiful. But Michael, please, please.
yeah. Well, Tyler, if you had something to share, okay. I wanted to talk about dreams. Um, Very excited to talk about dreams. Because I've had a couple really bizarre and interesting dreams. With prominent members of the this little corner of the internet. Featuring prominently. I had a dream a couple nights ago where I was on a couch with Paul Vanderklay and I was crying about being single. It was really strange. But the larger kind of thing that I have been thinking about is for me personally, and I'm curious, um, you know, how other people find this is that my dreams when I'm asleep and my dreams when I'm awake are very different. And not just like content wise, like when my dreams when I'm asleep seem to like usually involve some kind of wound or like shame or kind of like a lot of scenarios where like I'm being chased or
Hmm.
I'm like in some scenario where I'm like powerless or don't have agency. Um, and then during the day, my dreams are like almost kind of the inverse of that, where like often it's fantasizations about um, you know, moving into more expansiveness and like, kind of very future oriented, um, and kind of aspirations aspirations of like greater choice, greater agency, greater community, greater um so it seems to kind of be like the inverse of like this like vertical
Hmm.
axis of like um the dreams at night are kind of in there's someone I'm reading right now who talks about like the upper world, middle world, and underworld, and like the underworld kind of being very tied to like Jungian archetypes and like your shadow and things like that. And that's what it seems like a lot of the unconscious dreams are, and then the conscious dreams are like kind of much more about the ascent into um yeah, like you know greater community, greater love, whatever.
Hmm.
And like I've been reading some about Freud and what he talks about dreams. And it seems like he really puts an emphasis on the dreams that we have during the day, um, as well as the dreams we have at night, and how those dreams like very literally kind of inspire intentional action, and how they like literally like draw us out and like um kind of if those pictures are followed, kind of can elucidate a lot about our values, what we want in life, things like that. Um, so yeah, like I used to really not pay attention to my dreams. Um, and like I feel like more often than not, my dreams are like negative and disturbing, and like I wake up and I'm like, oh, thank God. that's not real. Like just thank God that's not my reality. But it like I'm trying to not just discard them because I think it's easy to be
Mhm.
like how does that have any relevance to my life? Like that's probably some wound when I was 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever. Um, but I'm yeah, and I kind of want to have like more of a kind of formal practice around dreams rather than just kind of journaling about them. Like, I'm curious if anyone, I don't know, has like worked with dreams in kind of a more like formal way, instead of kind of just yeah, instead of kind of just like writing down the content. But yeah, that's kind of all I had.
No,
So curious
I
what
think
anyone
it's
has to say.
a no. I'm glad. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'll give it to Tyler. I personally can't remember. Obviously, everyone dreams. I remember a dream once a year, like never. Michelle has extremely vivid Mizuzaki dreams, like every night. And you know, I'm always like, you should write them down. You know, and I'll let her speak for herself on if she does this. But you know, they're really, really beautiful dreams. Um, I think it's very, I also like how you're making this point to say there are dreams when you're awake versus dreams when you sleep. I think that's actually quite astute. I also sometimes wonder, I always think the difference between thinking and dreaming is not that different, actually. Like thinking has the same movement of dreams, especially people who think in pictures more so. The line between the dream and thought is thin, right? And there's a way in which like when you think, you're not bound by immediacy. You can think about what you want. Well, likewise, in dreaming, you can, but what you're thinking, it's almost, when you're awake, it's almost more difficult not to incorporate your immediacy into your thought, right? You end up thinking about what you're experiencing. But in dreams, it's actually, I think it's the same motion of thought. It's just not as likely to get hooked up with your sense experience, right? But thought is really always like dreams. I basically think often the brain has basically a single activity in a way of thinking. Now, I'm not going to take that too far. Obviously, there are emotions, but thinking I sometimes, let me put it this way. I wonder sometimes if the line between thinking and dreaming and daydreaming and envisioning, if sometimes these are just arbitrary lines that have some use, but really the essential activity of thought is similar, right? And also, in a way, I also think, and then I'll give it to Tyler and Javier, and these are just some opening thoughts. I also think it's very interesting that it seems like you can dream awake and asleep, but it seems like you can only have a nightmare when you're asleep. Like, I've never had a nightmare when you're awake. Now, I guess someone could push back on that and say trauma or when they have a breakdown or something. That might be the equivalent of it. But I guess when I'm thinking nightmare, where, you know, when you're asleep, you're like, by nightmare, I mean quite specifically the envisioning of some sort of hell demon chasing you or something, right? And you really getting overwhelmed by that feeling. If you envision a hell demon while you're awake, I don't think it has the same, and this may be wrong, but I don't think it has the same sort of like, how do I get out of this, right? You may not like it and like, ooh, that's scary and brush it away, but it doesn't have the same intensity, right? I find that very interesting. Because the reverse that I find interesting, and this one I'm not sure about, do people have mystical experiences when they dream? Like mystical experiences in that really deep way seem to be more of an awake thing, right? I'm not saying you can't have a dream that doesn't have a beauty to it. You wake up the next day, but I'm talking about that full blown strike of beauty in a kind of trance thing, right? This is all tentative. All of this could be wrong. But one of the reasons I think this is very interesting is because it seems like nightmares are reserved for when you sleep and mystical visions are reserved for when you're awake. But both of them have a certain dreamlike quality to them. Um, I'm not sure, but I'm very interested by that. And I'm also interested by the fact that if the idea that human, you know, if there's any time that humans are a head on a stick and they're not a body, it's when they're dreaming, when they're asleep, right? Like when you're asleep is when you actually are most like a disembodied being who just is a brain, right? And it's interesting to think if indeed the state when humans are practically just a brain, versus an embodied mind is when you have a nightmare. Whereas when you're in embodied consciousness is when you can have the mystical vision or the kind of beauty or the strike of beauty. Isn't that interesting? Because it would suggest that the road to hell is a kind of disembodiment where the ascent to heaven is an embodiment per se, right? And I just sometimes am very interested by the different qualities of thought that have some sort of similarity to dreamlike that are afforded when you're asleep versus when you're awake. And it seems like beauty is more on the awake side, whereas the nightmare is more on the sleep side. Now, I'm not saying that's right. It's just some thoughts I've had. I haven't ever written it out, but it's something that's interesting to me. So I really appreciate this awake dream versus sleep dream. You mentioned Freud, and Freud is obviously interesting on this, but let me give it to Tyler and Javier. Tyler Murphy, it is always a treat to have you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. I just, Michael, just wanted to share, like, so I've been talking to an analyst for a while now, and of course, a lot of it is probably, I will say, like the most beneficial and like the greatest insights have actually now come, especially in this last 3 months, have come from especially like 2 dreams that I had, and that work of being on the couch and just freely associating to the different elements in the dream. And it's kind of been mind-blowing. Like, I had actually kind of stopped doing analysis. I thought, I'd maybe gotten everything that I needed out of the experience. And then 2 of the dreams that I had mentioned in analysis before I kind of stopped, suddenly after maybe about a month, like clicked in a new way. And so anyways, that's just like, I guess, just personal testimony to like that. Yeah, there's something to it. And then that's made me fascinated with like looking into like case studies that you can read in like Bruce Fink, where he'll, like, I'm not going to tell you or the internet what my dreams were and how that how associating to them like solves certain contradictions that I've been wrestling with. But you can go read certain case studies and get a sense of, oh, okay, this is maybe how it works. But I would be curious if you guys ever, like, if say in a year or less, maybe I am done with analysis, I think that there will still be this ongoing practice that I'm going to live with of associating to the different elements in the dream. And that is it, maybe through journaling. I'm not exactly sure how, but now having seen the fruit and the benefit of associating to each element in the dream, there is something about having the presence of the analyst there that I don't know why that helps, but I don't know. Anyways, I just wanted to share kind of my personal experience to that.
No, I think that's magnificent. And I think that actually brings up some extremely important ideas. And I'll give it to Javier and Mr. Luber. And Aspasi, it is good to see you. I enjoyed speaking last night, 2 days in a row. I'm quite fortunate. And we're talking a bit about on what is dreams. Michael brought up dreams, interested in the question of dreams, how there can be, revelation in dream. And I'm interested in the fact, and I don't know if this is the case, that you can have, and Michael made the excellent point that you can dream when you're awake and when you're sleeping. I think that's very true. I'm interested in, sometimes it seems to me, as in when you're asleep, like what it seems like nightmares happen when you're asleep. Beauty can happen when you're awake, but you can have trauma in different things when you're awake. So I'm not saying it's a hard line, but I'm interested in the way thought moves. And to what Tyler was saying, for me to associate sleep with this kind of possibility of negativity into the nightmare is not to say sleep or dreams are bad. I'm taken by all the mythologies, and Jung was brought up on this idea that The dream world is where you have to go into, almost like descending into Hades, if you will, or Dante to Inferno, to come through into the beautiful, right? And Freud obviously he was always, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, he was always interested in how children seem to have simple dreams and adults have more complex dreams because there seems to be more repression going on with adults, right? And yet, the key to repression is it also has to unveil it because it's wanting to come out and you need to learn from it. But if you got the whole of it too quickly, it would destroy you. So there's a complexity and abstraction to the dream not because the truth isn't there, but because the truth has to be unveiled with the UN in parentheses, like Beatrice and Dante, right? So there's something to be learned in the dream that if you don't learn, there's some frozenness, some inability to move that becomes problematic. I personally think that thought is supposed to move like a dream. I think thought, when it is sublated, is not like an intentional act of, I'm going to solve this problem. It becomes more, when thought is creative and orbiting and seeking the beautiful, it actually becomes dreamlike, I think. It becomes more associational. You'll be walking down a path and suddenly have an idea. You'll have thoughts. It almost feels like you are a participant in a certain, dare I say, spirit or a certain movement of thought that you find yourself in that seems to be what thought is best as. Now, here's the trick, though. It seems as if in order to get thought to move as such, you have to go into the dream world. You have to go into the dark underworld. You have to go into the repressions to free thought so it can move like a dream. Otherwise, the movement of thought and dream are separated. Dream has this associational, image-based emotional structure, and thought is syllogistic. And if you don't go into the depths, then you can't bring thought and sublate together the syllogistic logic with the dreamlike creativity that's also emotional. And I think that is something Jung suggests. I think that's what many mythological stories suggest. And I think there is something interesting on having to go into the dream and, in a sense, risk the nightmare precisely so that you can free up thought into the fullness where it becomes more dreamlike. But that's not fantasy. That's actually getting at high-dimensional geometrical reality of being. I had to throw in a really fancy phrase at the end, but let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Rivera, it's good to see you, sir.
Yeah, good to be here. Yeah, I mean, I think Michael bringing this up is interesting. I mean, I've had several dreams that have woken me up from my state of being, or at least warned me. Yeah, I have one very, very, very honest one. It's funny. It was actually during the time I was reading Freud, actually, a lot of Freud and interpretation of the dreams. When I was getting ready to leave the army, I started having lots of dreams, actually. And it was funny. All the dreams that kept repeating were ones that were didn't let me escape. Like I basically had dreams that were like, no, you're gonna stay here. And that was actually my biggest fear, was that actually somehow I wasn't gonna be able to leave the army for some reason. But there's multiple ways to interpret that, though. Because Freud does talk about this, right? Like the manifest dream, right? The content of the dream. But then there's that other part of the dream that isn't manifest and may have contradictory or opposite meanings to them. Meaning that I could interpret it like this. I was afraid to leave. I wanted to stay. Now that sounds odd because that doesn't feel like it's true to my conscious intention. But when I reflect upon it, I don't think it's entirely false, because it was scary. The army was framing things to me where, you don't have free healthcare anymore. You don't have the free insurance anymore. You're gonna have to pay, your insurances and buy a house on your own. And you're not gonna make the same amount of money. And how are you gonna do that in that big world by yourself? That's how they kind of want to keep you there. So that's one, and Michael was bringing up this distinction where he's saying, well, I have dreams in the day and I have dreams in the night. What's really interesting is that I kind of found them deeply connected, because it was like the daytime was like, oh yeah, this this nice expansive exploration of adventure and so on. And then it seemed, Michael, that you were saying at night there was like a more confining, afraid pursuit, which is interesting because honestly, those things can really just go together at the same time, meaning that adventure and exploring can also be terrifying, confining, frightening. You know, all these things together can really just mold into like it's basically like an ambivalence, you know, like it is exciting, but it's also terrifying. It's also crippling. And you know, the last, I don't really have much to contribute on this issue, but I just have one last dream, which was what really woke me up out of my slumber. It's a very significant dream. Was that I was obsessed with reading Carl Jung. This is really funny, actually. I was really obsessed with finding my shadow self or whatever. But this dream, I remember very vividly, was that I was in this almost library, and there was these two women talking, but I was like very annoyed by them for some reason. But I decided to ignore them, and then I decided to, you know, I was hoping in the dream that I could find some books on Carl Jung. But all the books that I opened were empty. They had nothing in them. There was nothing in the books. They were all empty. All of them were empty. And I was frustrated. And the girls there were like, you know, giggling and kind of critiquing this one poet. And they were like, and then they turned to me and they said, "Do you know Emily Dickinson?" And I said, "No, I don't." And then the dream sort of ended. And what's really fascinating about that was I really tried to analyze this dream as much as I could. And for some reason, one day I decided to like literally just look up Emily Dickinson. Okay. And because I was obsessed with finding myself, this was all like centered around finding myself, because I felt like if I could encounter my shadow, then I could fully find myself, you know, kind of sort of a misunderstanding really of like the Carl Jung thing. But somehow I stumbled upon one of Emily Dickinson's poems it's called Nobody. And it was like, the moment you say you're somebody, like, don't say, you can't even say anything. It's like, I forget how the poem goes, but it's basically like, don't say that you are somebody, or don't say that you are nobody, because then you become somebody, you know, it's something like that. But anyways, the poem with this embodiedness of nobody, of becoming nobody, it was such an existential release to hear that, to be no one, because of the existential pressure I was putting in and the effort I was putting in and finding my identity. That ironically, this dream was actually the very thing that helped me to let go of this obsession, this idea of how can I find myself. Really, I'm really just chasing my tail. I'm really just running into blank pages. You know what I'm saying? Just a force of interpretation in there. But all right, but I'm done.
I think you have a lot to contribute. That was magnificent. You know, it's very interesting. Obviously, there's a long tradition of prophecy, vision, stuff like that goes with dreams. And sometimes I do wonder with dreams if it's the idea that you need like a vision to actually motivate you, because the idea is not enough. And maybe there's almost a way where your now this is all speculating. Maybe there's almost a way where your subconscious mind is like, the idea that it's going to be okay is not enough, or the idea is not enough, so let me put you in a movie. Then you'll feel it, then you'll get it, and then you'll remember it, right? Like also too, just as a note, if the book of Revelation in the Bible was just like a straight like treatise, people wouldn't be studying it forever, right? It's precisely the etheric nature of it, for good and for bad, that can bring more motivation to kind of care about it. And I sometimes wonder if there's something in the psyche or whatever that almost has an understanding of that, and dreams as a vision format can almost be a way to bring about motivation that otherwise would not be there. And you could argue that art is on the same gradient at that, right? Of trying to create motivation when basic syllogism is not enough. I think also you said something very important where the dream is a revelation that emotions are not simple, like that there are many facets to an emotion all at the same time. I think when we're awake, we can break it down into binaries because we can actively rationally think. And basically, rational thought is primarily in the business of distinction. And the natural reaction to an emotion is to define it and to spread it apart, good, bad, or kind of split it. But that idea that you're saying, like, if I were to ask you what emotion does the novel make you feel, Walker Percy said the novel is the emotion. The whole of it is the emotion. It doesn't have a feeling, right? And actually, emotions actually are kind of that truth. And in the dream, there's almost maybe there's a sense in which your conscious mind can't make the mistake so easily of breaking it apart. And actually, you're feeling many things at once in the way that you were describing. I do wonder if there's a phenomenology of dreams to be had. A phenomenology as asking what are the conditions of possibility necessary for a dream to be experienced X way versus Y way. I think we ask phenomenology within the awake when we're awake, but there might be a way to approach phenomenology in the dream, which would require either the skill of lucid dreaming or a very good memory to ask, that's excellent, Aspasia, I completely agree, to kind of ask, okay, if I can experience this in a dream, what must I actually be like to be able to afford myself this kind of experience? And that might give you better tools to understand yourself in daily life. So for example, if you realize emotions come multifaceted in the dream, you might go, maybe emotions are multifaceted and maybe I should think about them more differently, as we've discussed on anger, for example. So I think that's really, really fascinating. I will give it to Mr. Luber, Michael, and then Mr. Jockin. But I think also there's something about dreaming that is fundamentally unveiling with the UN in parentheses. I do think that. And I think also if that's the case, we talk about beauty all the time. If beauty is something that you can't handle all at once without being destroyed and you have to move toward it, then dream and then thought sublated with dream might be thought positioning itself to actually be toward the beautiful in an unveiling structure that it can handle that isn't syllogistic, because that would collapse the beautiful to the good, right? If thought could only think the syllogism per se, then it would always have to collapse beauty to the good. But if thought is actually capable of some sort of dream quality, if rationality is brought into it, then it could actually be moved to the beautiful without collapsing it. And the last thing I'll say is I actually write down all my dreams, and I've had 83 since 2012. And my first dream in October 13th, 2012, is that a girl in a story out of a book gave me $250 to go to Captain D's, but I couldn't find a place to park. So that was 2012. And the last dream I had was February 12th, 2023. We're on a porch in a nice afternoon, and I see cows coming through the field. The bull shows up, but a bear kills it. And then I lock ourselves inside and feel bad that I didn't feed the bear, but I decide that it's the best course of action. That was my last dream in 2023. And so I've had 83 since 2012. So I'll pass it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
You're a hoot. You really are a hoot. Isn't it funny how when you tell someone their dream, it's funny most of the time. Like even like this was my nightmare. Like even hearing someone else's nightmare, because it's just simply like an unveiling. It doesn't ground it in anything tangible in the sense of like, sure, you can like analyze it and like find some, oh, this might be the motivation. It's always a might be with a dream. But because of that, it's just always funny, or at least to me. Like there's this like overwhelming sense of humor because it's in this mode where the function is just revealing. It's simply revealing. And because it's simply revealing, there's like this overwhelming determinacy of being that's actually occurring. And because it's overwhelming, this determinacy of being, you laugh. Like you literally laugh. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I kind of wanted to tie I raised my hand because I had this intention of what I wanted to say, because I've been really past like week and a half been just thinking a lot. I'm meeting Jim Rutt Friday, so I've been preparing for that because I wasn't well. I didn't study this whole, game B world too much, and now I really, really see how like storytelling and theme is gonna really shake that shit up. Like I really got a grip on that. I think. Who knows? We'll see. But uh, the the funny thing is, and this has to do with self-forgetting, and then I kind of want to lead this into my thoughts coming into today. Not to go too much on a tangent with that, but forgive me. There's this mechanism, this like baseline initial mode of like revealing. Call it a dream, call it beauty, or call it the way of dreaming, let's say, and beauty, etc. You can say God, whatever. What humans do is they realize what's being revealed, and then the feedback loop begins from that point. So the question is how to mediate and dictate that feedback loop. And like how you approach that determines the society that you live in, essentially. And we're at a point of awareness where we have forgotten, in like a healthy way, I would actually argue, we have forgotten, like Heidegger says, forgetting being in this like negative way. But like I kind of want to put a twist on it for this conversation and say this is actually a good thing, because forgetting exactly this like baseline reveal of just letting being be actually allowed us to really focus on a particular feedback loop to that revealing. That feedback loop, call it game A, is failing, and it's failing insofar as it's actually helping us remember that we forget how dynamic the reveal is. Like we don't actually, I could argue none of us know how dynamic it is. We can only speculate based off of getting a glimpse of it. But there definitely was societies where it was in this like prototype game B mode. And it was a constant understanding of, like, if I use the game A, game B logic, there was just a constant, we are both in game A and B, ergo there actually is no distinction. And we're just in this mode of like constant pre-novelty entering novelty. This constant dialectic of something normal and it immediately crossing over to like a novelty mode of being. And like that happened so much, and then it kind of progressed into a deadlock of a certain feedback loop, a certain mode of how it goes from non-novelty to novelty. And we got stuck in this in a rigid way of approaching that. I think what conversations like this with dreams do, it helps break up that mode, and it helps position the individual into realizing how there could be different feedback loops from this reveal, from this baseline reveal. So that's where like I think philosophy comes in. So like philosophy helps you realize that there's different modes of how you, not different modes, there's different feedback loops other than the rigid one in which you're situated in, because you understand how dynamic this reveal baseline is. Storytelling comes in after you understand that. So it's even after that. It's like, okay, now that I understand that, now what? Storytelling, like you said in the comment, someone said in the comment how it comes after this dreamlike state. Storytelling is storytelling, and proper storytelling is understanding your story in relation to this grand narrative, call it the reveal state. So how you come up with your feedback loop, how you come up with your story, has to always be in relation to this grand narrative of this reveal state. And a lot of people like Desmond, I've been back on Desmond since that video that Guy Sensak put out. Thank you, Guy. He basically situates philosophy where it's not quite philosophy, because it's acknowledging so much so in the philosophy how it's trying to create other feedback loops in this in relation to this baseline state. So anytime you're talking about other feedback loops in relation to this baseline state, you've moved past, you're beyond philosophy. You're doing something more tangible, where like you're actually going to make people like you're going to throw them into action. So with that being said, the question is how, and this directly has to do with story democracy. How do we create a structure where it affords people to have their own feedback loop, and at the same time acknowledge the dynamic reveal baseline state without diminishing other people's means of discovering their own feedback loop? And that the only way to do that is by being technical about your storytelling. You have to be very precise in how you pick each component of the feedback loop, and not only how you pick it, but you have to be able to understand and articulate how it relates back to that dynamic baseline, that dynamic reveal state, the dream way, however you want to call it. And that means you can't totalize any one feedback loop. There is no one mode of saturation, referring to Ebert's work. And how to do that is to be real about what story you have, which is like being vulnerable, like having the state of vulnerability. And forgive me that I keep going on and on. I just want to get it. I just want to word vomit it out. So how you become technical about it, you have to actually you have to sublate philosophy. Like, you can't be strictly philosophical anymore. Like, the conversation completely changes. And the conversation is more like, how did I get here? Like, literally, as an individual, how did I, through experience, arrive to this state where I am operating under this modality? Like, how do I even understand the modality in which I, in experience, operate under? And like, you seriously think about, and this is where like psychoanalysis comes in, and thinking about, yourself. Like, you gotta save yourself first before you save the world. And like, saving yourself first kind of starts with really understanding your own story and like sticking to it. Like, having a theological direction for yourself. And I think that's where like the absolute choice comes in, for sure. And I have so much to say. I'm gonna I'll finish it off with it wouldn't be appropriate. This is where I'm conflicted with the internet, public internet, at least. At this state, it feels inappropriate to have a legitimate conversation about your story. That means you have to talk about things that other people would be like, you would be like, quote unquote, ashamed of. You'd be embarrassed to talk about. Like, I'll give like the classic like the wife beater example, where it's like, you don't want to talk about how your husband or your partner absolutely abuses you in all the ways that they abuse you, and how you still put up with it, because you don't want people to like look down on you or whatever, any negative lens. So like, having a conversation about storytelling, that mode of storytelling, literally requires vulnerability on the level of you throwing out your deep, dark secrets in order to create a sound feedback loop that relates to this fundamental baseline reveal, the standing out and being. And like that is so hard to do and come to grips in, and it's even hard to like express and articulate. And that's where I think like going to therapy and these different businesses, because it's like they're whatever you want to call it, these different places to go, that's really at the heart what they're trying to do, is to make you like come to grips and actually see how your story is beautiful. Like for you to actually see how your story is like beautiful, you gotta really find the like. It's hard for me. I hate using words that I make up, but it's hard for me not to think about it. That's when you have to really take seriously what the causer of your situation is, and like to really embrace that and to own it, like publicly own it. And I just don't see. I think our world is so far away from publicly owning this and expressing this causer, because for some people it's like, oh, I have porn addiction, oh, I have like one of my things, which is like I have weird shit with food, like I have ARFID, like I reject shit in an absurd way, and I like would cry and stuff, and I'm a 28-year-old man. Like a lot of people have a hard time saying that. Like that's just one of the many. I don't even think I'm there yet. I just think I express one facet of this dark shadow that needs to actually come to the light and publicly to the light in order for me to actually get to a place where I am a true storyteller, and ergo I can like infect that into the world in which I'm living in. So it's hard for me to actually see us getting to a game B situation because we can't do that. We literally can't do that. And that's where I guess the Dark Renaissance, that's kind of in a certain sense what the Dark Renaissance is poking at with like the emphasis of like psychoanalysis and Freud. But I'll just leave it at that. I'm kind of just like preparing for this gym talk, so forgive me if I'm derailing this conversation. Love you guys.
You are not, and Jim Rudd is lucky to have you. And I do certainly like Jim Rudd. His conversations with particularly Stu Kaufman, he has quite a few that are quite outstanding, and I do appreciate his work on complexity theory. And Michelle and Jason, is very much good to see you. So a few things come to mind, and then I'll pass it to Michael. So first, on that question of how did we get here, I do think that's basically how Hegel starts things. And that's where modern philosophy and uncertainty and doubt are actually the beginning of thought, not the end of it, right? Because you've gotten somewhere, and yet it is very difficult to actually bring into thought how you got there. And so there's the question of that. And then a lot of philosophy is simply the journey of thought to return to where you are, but the return is not the same as simply a repetition. The return is in RE parentheses. And that's very interesting because a good story also, when you close the book, you're not the same person. As you go back to the kitchen, after you read the story, you're a different kind of person, right? I think also you were quite astute to suggest, if I use the word correctly, the metaxis. Literature or true storytelling is in the metaxis, the between space of feedback loops. And also the feedback structure you were describing alludes to the great value of Alex Ebert's freak theory, because the feedback reaches the saturation point and then there's a new cycle and so on and so forth. But literature actually is when characters are located between feedback loops. I think that's exactly right. My favorite example is, of course, Hamlet, because Hamlet is caught between the feedback loop of Jerusalem and the feedback loop of Greek, of Athens and Jesus. He is in a Christian society, but his father has shown up as Apollo, telling him to get revenge, and revenge is moral. But of course, under Jesus, revenge is not moral. And he has to do what? Make an absolute choice between those. He is in the metaxis, if you will. And I think the same goes with the Brothers Karamazov. I think basically all great literature has a character caught between feedback loops, as you were describing, that have been hit by a causer that has forced upon them the realization of this between space in which they have to make an absolute choice. And often a tragedy is where the absolute choice crushes them. A commedia is one where the absolute choice is one that they rise to the occasion of making. I think also everything you were saying about the confession, et cetera, so forth, there is something about, it's the feedback, there's this opening and closing, and there has to be a way which you're able to open, but you're also to close and start a new feedback loop, and back to the bases and a new feedback loop. And that, you could say, perhaps that is the mechanism of the infinite expansion of creation and possibility of God in the creative act. The fact that it has this kind of wave structure, maybe, is quite interesting. But then human beings need to align with it and go with it, and that would require them to be able to go to any part of themselves, the darkest, the dreamlike, the Netherland. Otherwise, they can't complete the collapse, or they can't complete the expansion, if you will, and there will be a frigidity to it. But what you were saying there about everyone needing to get to the place where you could be completely vulnerable, this is the problem of confession that churches faced, right? Churches and Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodoxy, is everyone, like religions, have strongly struggled with the problem of confession. Foucault identified that confession could be used to control people, but then a later Foucault kind of acknowledged the necessity of confession and kind of wished that we did have confession. Also, it's going to be very difficult to have a world of pure vulnerability when we are not able to handle the question of forgiveness, because the question of forgiveness, you could argue, and justice are the massive ones that are destroying the secular society, right? If you're at least a Christian, and I just use that example, or you believe in God, you say, well, we're all imperfect, none of us are God, therefore that's the basis of forgiveness or understanding. You have a massive problem where if you don't have that construct, because then forgiveness is hard to separate from enablement or allowing injustice, right? So you have a problem of forgiveness now that hinders moving into that direction. You also have a difficulty of people being able to hear one another's stories and not responding to them with solutions, so the correct address to stories. And I think what you're suggesting, perhaps there's a collective subconscious realization of the need for something like that, ergo the growth in therapy, people turning to counselors, looking for communities, et cetera, so forth. I think first, to get to that place, we're going to have to at least be able to handle hearing people's different political views without hating them. And we're still at that stage. We're not even at the stage yet where we're able to learn that people actually have different views of how the world should work, or different views of how people think. We're, in a sense, if there is a certain Hegelian movement of development, which is a return to first premises we've lost, we're going to have to first be able to handle learning that people actually think different from us, because we tend to get quite triggered from that and go nuts. Look at all the tribalism, right? Well, if we get to the place where we can handle that, then you could start moving into the vulnerability. And I would note to everything that you've just said, and yes, also to the game B point, basically the Dark Renaissance is saying, well, that's going to work until the problem of forgiveness shows up. That's going to work until you have the jester that destroys things and doesn't follow the game B. Or my argument is you have a, what destroys all decentralized efforts in history is a real moral disagreement, where you have two people disagree on something is an ethical violation or not. So, for example, in America, it was obviously slavery with the Civil War. Probably what will destroy decentralized efforts, or could, is something like animal rights. One community thinks it's okay to eat meat, the other does not. And the community goes, well, if we really think this is murder, are we going to allow that other community to do it? It's one thing to talk about diversity when it's not involving moral differences, entirely a different thing when you're talking about moral differences. And basically, the clock is always ticking on decentralized efforts before a moral disagreement arises that then forces the hand, or feels like it forces the hand, of one of the communities, that leads to all sorts of issues. But maybe the logic of storytelling could happen with that, but then people would have to develop that. The final thing I'll say, and give it to Michael, Mr. Jockin, Aspasia, and Mr. Luber. Tim Adlin, if you're listening to this, everything that Andrew said is basically voice craft. That is the skill set that is being developed and has to be worked on and moved through, where you're actually using content to create the kind of subjects that can move in the way that you were describing, Mr. Luber. And basically, without that mode, without that being spread and something people are habituated into, then any possible movement into a world where people can handle true difference, let alone vulnerability, because I think you could argue vulnerability is through diversity. It's like a higher level of the kind of vulnerability you're saying. Like, it's one thing to say people are different, and then vulnerability is the full exposure of that difference, right? If you grant me that, right? Like, there is a vulnerability in encountering difference at all, but the sort of radical transparency, maybe in a Ray Dalio sense that you're describing, Mr. Luber, would first require us to be able to handle the reality of difference. And then we can begin working toward the fullness of that difference in full vulnerability. But that does require people to be trained by a certain mode that, again, I associate with voicecraft. And I think it is toward the beautiful. But let me give it to Michael. Michael, please.
Yeah, this is really great. I almost don't know where to start. I think where I'll start is what Andrew was talking about with the difference between game B and game A, and I kind of wanted to relate that to the nightmare versus daytime like mystical awakening experience. And again, I also have kind of a very cursory knowledge of game A versus game B, but kind of what I understand with game A is um there's like a system and a structure that's put in place that um everything we're talking about with diversity, vulnerability, creativity, resilience, like it incentivizes away from that. It's like a very risk averse system. Individuality is not prioritized. Like it's very much like I guess you could think of it as like the individual creative spirit is kind of sublated for this like economic model that kind of um orients people in a certain way and like disincentivizes them you know from agency really. And so like that feels very resonant with the experience of the nightmare, which is like a lot of people feel like they're being chased or they feel like they're chasing something that um, they're kind of being compelled to by some external force, as opposed to, you talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Like I think what is so terrifying about a nightmare is just you feel like a puppet on a string. And it feels like you can't, like it feels like you're being possessed, and it feels like you can't get out of that situation. Whereas in the daytime, like you were referencing earlier about, maybe experiencing like this demonic force or, something negative during the day. And yeah, kind of sleep, definitely, like definitely sleep paralysis is like connected to that. Whereas like in the day, there's like this feeling of spaciousness and like ownership over external forces, and obviously each person, depending on um their personality type, their ability to like uh kind of salience landscape, like has differing abilities to kind of control what inputs they're receiving. But I think you know talking about like storytelling, um I think the what what like provides the mystical experience of the kind of daytime revelation is this sense that like someone is moving into their own story, and they're like authoring it as the experience is happening. So there's like a real sense of like process, as opposed to kind of having their feeling like their story has been written for them, which I think is like is like an experience of like a traumatic flashback maybe, is like this feeling that like this experience, usually something that happened to them as opposed to something that they like self-directed, is kind of governing their life. And when Andrew was talking about these like baseline reveals and like the feedback loops that good storytelling affords, I was thinking about therapy and how like I see therapy as like storytelling and often story retelling. It's like as the therapist, like you're facilitating someone potentially for the first time in their life, like taking this script that they have and kind of like um editing it, and amending it, subtracting some things, like tinkering with it, like crafting it. And like I think that's like the craft of therapy. So I'd be really like fascinated to potentially talk to Andrew about storytelling and kind of the intersection of, like trauma processing and like agential storytelling and things like that. The last thing I'll say is back to what Javier was talking about, and I think he made like an excellent point where he connected like the feelings I was having with the kind of nightmare and the like the daytime dreams, and how there's like potentially an interplay there. I think that's exactly right. I think every like future oriented dream of prosperity and expansion has built into it something that you're moving away from. I mean, you can think about it in like a storytelling sense with like push and pull factors, right? Like what are the characters being pulled towards, and what are they being pushed like away from? And I think just thinking about that in this context, it's like there's like early like traumatic wounds that we all have that inform like how we want to structure and move our lives, not necessarily to like move away from those because we're like scared of that potential. Like I think that can also bring with it problems, and I think like good therapy like acquaints someone with those experiences, and kind of helps to dissolve the fear around those like showing up again. But I think everyone kind of has a story of like what they're being pulled towards and what it seems like they're being pushed away from. And I think having an awareness of the signaling of both really affords like an understanding of kind of your past, present, and future. So yeah, that kind of like dual motivation is really interesting. One more thing that I have in my notes, and I'll pass it back, is isn't it kind of funny that like the more like when you wake up and you're like, oh, I really want to like jot down that dream, like the more you think about it, the more elusive it becomes. It's like the more you try and like put like conscious attention on it, the more it just dissolves. And I was just thinking about like, there's so much talk about, like the attempt to concretize and like know God is like, it's kind of when you destroy God, is like you have to, like we were talking about this last week, like you have to, like there has to be mystery in order for it to be something that draws you in every time. And like what if that's what's happening with dreams? Like what if we're not supposed to know it entirely? Like like we're kind of poking fun at like the people in this group or don't dream or can't remember their dreams or whatever, and it's kind of seen as like ah, shoot, like I wish that I could, but like what if, yeah, like, I don't know, what if there's like what if there's kind of like a beauty and like a necessity and like, oh, I have like a figment of this dream, or it's like an idea, or it's a feeling, or it's like one image, and then when I'm in my waking life, I then try and build, like I take that seed and then I like build it. I don't know. Anyways, I'm just talking. So I don't know. Yeah.
No, I think that's all magnificent. You said a lot there that was really, really good. And I'll pass it to Jockin, Aspasia, Andrew Luber, and Sam Willem. It is always a treat to see you. Thank you for coming by. A complete delight. There's something very interesting, first, on that idea that a dream carries you, like a nightmare takes you away. It's very interesting because then that says there's something vulnerability. There's something, one, about freedom, free will, determination there. I always do think the fact that you feel a certain contrast of agency between a dream and real life does suggest a certain proof of freedom. The fact that you actually know the experience of not having control in a dream, and then you contrast that with life, but then also in a dream where you feel like you don't have agency suggests that you know a feeling of what it's like to have agency. So it creates some kind of negative proof in a way. But it is interesting because that feeling of being carried is vulnerability fundamentally. And in a nightmare, it's almost like vulnerability was taken advantage of. Whereas perhaps in a vision, vulnerability is leading you toward beauty. Because when you have a vision, and even a great artistic moment where you see the movie or you see the poem, and it almost feels like it's not you, but it's carrying you, there's a way in which that structure is like vulnerability that is reward, or like, I'm so glad I was vulnerable. But in the nightmare, it's almost a feeling of, oh, vulnerability was betrayed, right? And so there's something very interesting too, also where vulnerability and intimacy goes together. Because when you look at these visions, there's something for the artist when they have a vision, or the prophet, or there's a kind of intimacy in it. There's a certain feeling of intimacy in the disclosure. And it's very funny because the feeling of being pulled is both precisely the feeling that leads to the greatest horrors, but also the feeling of the greatest intimacies. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I think also what you were saying there on, if you think about it, it goes away. So I've killed all my dreams. That's why I don't have them. I'm such a monster. There is something there which I do think suggests that there is something about dream as the revelation of thought structured appropriately as fundamentally apophatic. Because I think thought is supposed to orbit more than get. And we're supposed to get to the degree that we orbit. And dreams are a reminder of what thought is supposed to be. More can be said, but let me give it to the wonderful Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you. It is always a treat, sir.
Always a pleasure. Dreams this is a fun one. This is a very interesting topic. Aristotle does have a text on dreams. It's incredibly short. I actually reread the whole thing, waiting for like when this conversation started. So he does have he has a very small section about dreams. I think the best I can contribute for this is one is a very big part is that the operation of thought, right, between apprehension and judgment, that this linking of that's basically what dreams are for Aristotle. I think that's quite important because basically the three modes of thought, apprehension, judgment, and ossification, you don't even get to the ossification. There's actually this commentary in Aristotle he talks about this in dreams where you have a sensation and the judgment, basically, they may be disagreeing with each other. He uses examples like when you cross your fingers by your sense of touch, you know it's two, but if you have your hands in a certain position, you see it as one. So you're getting contradictory sensation information at the same time. And this all leads to a very larger point, he says in that section, where this leads to a general principle of phantasms, is that they linger. Perceptions can linger in thought. So you may not get direct access to it. The direct sensation might not affect you in the moment. It may affect you way later. And actually, that's one of the premises of emotion, right? The whole point is that you have an emotion that you carry. Think about when you carry over being angry from one context to a whole other context. Someone who wasn't even at fault for you being angry, you just let it out on them, as an example. There's this kind of, I always add this image in my head is of people, because of our souls and with these these phantasms, they're almost like a second order property inside us that just reverbs off everything else around us. So the stimulus from the outside can be completely separate from what's going on the inside. But that's partly why we seem so incredible, so completely misunderstandable in context, because from the outside, it looks like there's absolutely, this makes no sense. Why did you get mad about this guy cutting you off on the car, for example, when in reality, no one knows except you that maybe 30 minutes ago, you got an argument with your partner, for example, right? So that kind of that lasting resonance or reverbage of memory, of sensation, basically Aristotle says that's what dreams are. That's basically what it is from the sense perception. So, but that's, that takes dreams, at least in terms of the sleeping side. But when we talk about the language of dreams during the day, I think of two things instantly. One is the kind of mode of daydreaming that you're bored. So I think the boredom operation is a really interesting one, where you're that way you can see very logical connection because there's a disengagement of the stimulus in front of you, and your brain's let to just wander in imagination. But the other one I want to point down, this relates to kind of, I think, what Michael said, he kind of stole my thunder on this part, which was that these dreams seem to be passive, like acts of being acted upon, right? The nightmare. even just that's the whole point, that they seem to be just passive acts of the body or mind working on itself. But there is a positive, I mean, not positive in the sense of good, but in the sense of not being acted upon, but acted. You're the one in the act. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream. I say that because it's interesting, because those, I suppose that is a positive affirmational, that's a affirmment of a coordinating action of stating a first principle for other people to coordinate around. I just find that really interesting, because in Aristotle, he talks about the relationship of choice and wish, and he says all choices are wishes, but not all wishes are choice. The reason why is because wishes could be of the impossible. You can wish to be immortal. That's not in the realm of possibility. Or you can wish for certain things to be the case, but you don't have actually the power to do anything about it. But when you do choice, that's explicitly, those are things in your power and in the realm of real reality of possibility. But when Martin Luther King Jr. does that I have a dream speech, and he gives this kind of coordinating action of how we should orient our society and how to relate with one another, I think that's just really interesting, because instead of bringing an individuated action within oneself, this is actually an action of a first principle being presented to everybody else into a public space for people to organize around. Is it around the good? Of course it is. But I just find that interesting, especially within Aristotle, when we talk about first principles cannot be deliberated. You only reason you work with them. They're not really even allowed to be discussed or directly talked about. They're just worked with as a given. But when we see dreams seem to be actually pointing to, when we're talking about this Martin Luther King way, or this kind of breakage, disconnect of the Rossification between judgment and apprehension, we almost have a kind of revealing of a mode of thought, as Daniel said, right? Kind of a very particular operation of thought. Now, that argument of where beauty stands in this, it's just an interesting part. Because I think it does relate to this idea of relationship of receptivity, right? Being willing to be intimate, and this kind of intimacy and being respondent to. Yes, because I think especially when under the critique of Aristotle, this framing of the wish and choice, basically because Daniel all language of the absolute choice, right? This is all about the question of impossibility. Like that's the main distinctional part. When it seems to be beauty, because that's kind of thing, it kind of strikes through a possibility that may not have even thought before. So it kind of draws out some epistemic qualities of how we even think, and what dreams can point out to. I think there's other aspects of dreams, like this whole these kind of moments of management of anxiety, or runs of flight, a possibility of thought, especially in the daydream operation we think about when you're bored. And I think you talked before about that, about boredom. Being a very modern way of thought. And I think in general, too, even this whole discussion, right? Because in Buber's point about movies, I'm reminded of the framing of suspicion of disbelief and fiction. Because that's what all this seems to be tying on, is that these moments of, it's not real, but you're willing to not judge on it. This is also why Aristotle's notion about that this breaking of judgment from apprehension seems to map on over here. Yeah, but very interesting. I think it's just a very interesting point about dreams, and both in terms of its kind of abstractional symbolic meaning. Because, for example, in a religious context, in Islam, dreams are considered very legitimate. They're actually a mode of prophecy, especially when it's dreams from God. There can be dreams from Satan, but they also be from God. So as a result, dreams have a very important spiritual domain. In fact, in the Sufi tradition, there's an entire world of reality of dreams that the angelic spaces work within and we have access to when we sleep, for example. So it's just an interesting topic. I've enjoyed it so far.
No, magnificent. And I'll pass it to Aspasia, Mr. Luber. Sam, as just very quickly, as you were pointing to, for me personally, dreams are the revelation that the mind has a certain unlimitedness to it, a certain unboundness. We can think basically, especially when you're asleep, because your mind is active. It can think anything. It can create creatures. I mean, I'm always taken by how a dream creates an entire world. It never just creates an object. You don't just see a dragon. When you dream, you see a dragon in a kingdom and an entire world. Like dreams world, which is pretty remarkable. Like it's not a single thought. It brings about an entire world like that. Pretty crazy. The reason why I think this is important is because if there's some seeming unlimited potential to the mind in what it can create, well, then also it could be a source of unlimited pain and hell for people. And thus beauty, community, love, relationships become insanely important. Because if the brain is this powerful, then if we hurt another human being and leave them with their brain, there is no telling what kind of suffering they can go through. And for me, dreams, the fact that the brain is so able to do what it is able to do has always, for me, been a reason why emphasizing beauty is so important. Because in a sense, if you don't have the health, the medicine, the pharmacist, if you will, of the beautiful, or to direct this seemingly incredibly powerful mind toward the beautiful, then you're taking a chance that it ends up falling back into the nightmarish. So to me, like, dreams reveal actually how powerful let me put it this way. We think that rationality unveils the power of the brain. I think dreams unveil the power of the brain. Rationality is localized, syllogistic, and contained. And so there's always a way which in rationality we're like, well, you know, let me put it this way. If you emphasize rationality, the emphasis of being careful with one another's minds go down, because rationality feels like you're in control, that you can like just fix things pretty easily, right? But if you take the dream as the primary revelation of the mind, then we all contain a certain incredible power that we ourselves can't fully control. And we ought to be really work to try to relate with one another in a good way, or we will unleash that power within one another on ourselves. And who knows what that will do. And I think we see that in trauma. So if you overemphasize the technical mind, the rational mind, then you can downplay the damage you can do to one another, because they can just get over it. Just don't do it. Just don't be angry. Just stop feeling. That's what people say. Well, just stop, right? That's not how the mind works, right? It is this unlimited powerhouse. So for me, making the dream primary does create a certain awareness of what we do in relationships, and to treat them with a certain more care, and to learn the skills of relationships a little better. I also would associate, there's something about dreams and trust that I find very interesting. Because what happens in the nightmare is you feel like, what else? I can't trust anything. What else can happen if I get pulled into this, right? And society, going to Hecuba in that extremely important play, when she comes home and finds out her best friend killed her son, she goes, untrustworthy, everything I see cannot be trusted. And she becomes an animal, because trust holds the world together in a sense, right? And if you don't have trust, things collapse. There's a way in which the dream can kind of revolve to how the structures are all held kind of conventionally, but if they're not there, you could fall back forever. But also, too, those could be a platform to ascend upward. So there's something about trust there I would have to elaborate on. But again, I think dreams are what we should really emphasize as a revelation of what the mind can do and how it works. And it is this mixture of things we control and don't control, it, and can lead us places we don't want to go, but can also be wonderful, and that all of us are walking around with that kind of power inside of us. And we also be aware that when we interact with other people, we are impacting that power. And we might set it off like a grenade if we're not more aware. But more can be said, but let me give it to Aspasia. Aspasia, it is a delight to have you. It's good to see you, ma'am. Please.
So nice to see you. I want to suggest too that I think the body is like this ideal map or medium or something for metaphor in this regard. So there's this nightmare that I used to have over and over again until relatively recently in my life, where I would be chased, this typical trope of I would be chased into a confined space, and then the person would snap my back in half, and it was explicit, and it was excruciating. I would feel the pain sometimes, and obviously terrifying. And I would wake from these dreams being frightened, and one way that one might think about that dream in the first instance is a fear of the powerful other. And we could go down that path, but then the more that I really questioned that dream and sort of did my own work, the more it came to me quite suddenly once. I realized that actually that's what I had wanted to do in my life a lot, especially in my younger years. I actually remembered, once I'd done the work, these impulses I had when I was very young, with people in my life I remember thinking, I just want to snap them in half. And I realized that actually in the dream, in a roundabout way, it was me coming face to face with my own repressed urges and wishes that had come about from very intense emotions from being in particular dynamics when I was young. And this was completely absent to me. Like that all sounds quite obvious right now. And it seems completely obvious to me right now. But I was so blind to that. I was only experiencing that dream as, someone else doing something to me. And then as I realized that, I also realized that with that came, now I was reconnected back into this huge power I had inside me, to just notice that with anger can come, obviously not me going and snapping people's backs in half, but through the repression, through fear of seeing that impulse at a very young age, I then cut off completely from that vat of power inside me. And actually what that meant is that I then did allow people to dominate me. And I allowed myself into the position more than I should have, to have people snap me in half. And so once I realized that, I could then also see that in a roundabout way, it's almost, there was sort of a version, I don't know how to put it into words, but there is almost a version of me, now that I look at that dream, that I am both of those things. I am the person that is chasing me, and I am the me that is having my back snapped. And actually, yes, I've had enough of operating in that way. And I do want to snap that version of my functioning in half. I do want to end it. And so I can also see it in that way, that it's actually like it became this invitation of something deep inside me trying to show me quite violently and with this incredible excruciating pain that was what finally got my attention. Like I would have this dream for a while, and then it wasn't until I actually started to feel the pain that it was shaking me into, you really have to look at this. There is something here. And so rather than, so once I was able to do that, and I was able to see that I am living in a way that is inviting others to mistreat me. But also, yeah, I don't want to say that it's always so, it's always done so consciously, because it's not, but I'm putting myself into that position through the very cutting off from my own anger and power. I call it anger, obviously. People call it different things, but I see it as anger because I don't see anger as the same thing as acting aggressively. I just see it as the emotion in the body, and then we choose how to channel that and what that's telling us we might want to do with our actions. But I cut myself off from my own assertiveness is one way of looking at it. And so through once it was able to grab my attention in that manner, and I was able to see that there is this way I am functioning that is keeping me restricted, keeping me from my own power, then it went away. I haven't had that dream, and it sort of unlocked my ability to look at things inside myself that no longer seemed terrifying. And actually the terror was me confronting my own repressed urges and impulses and emotions and parts of myself. I mean, that's just one example. There's obviously a lot. There's a lot of other ways, a lot of other examples of that. But I'm so thankful for that nightmare. I'm so thankful for it. And I guess, I mean, you could argue maybe it's just the way that I was able to use that nightmare. But the fact that it then disappeared. And so rather than remain in the position of having this nightmare over and over and being terrified of it showing up night after night, not knowing when it would arrive, feeling like, I mean, rather than that, I was able to actually get in touch with something that was much stronger within me, and the nightmare disappeared. I mean, I suggest all this because, well, it ties into lots of themes of what we're talking about. But, you know, even just that idea of snapping the back in half, or, you know, like this idea of the body as being kind of an ideal landscape on which we can locate. So even to say that to someone, that already evokes so much analogy, metaphor, you know, and so I think that dreams, especially if they are centered on the body, they can tell us so much just through the manner in which it is expressed on the body, is essentially what I'm saying. I think it's pretty straightforward. We can already extrapolate so much about what it is that they might be trying to get at and evoke. And yeah, I just wanted to share that, because yeah, the dream was really an invitation to see my own repression. And I think I said this in the chat before, but I think that something about a nightmare is that it combines, quite often the content of what has been repressed is something that might be aggressive, or might be taboo socially. And so, you know, it's often the case that it would be an aggressive or a sexual nature. There's something about it that I think would make it feel more like a nightmare, say, as opposed to a dream. But also there's a forcefulness to it. That's what I think. It's that idea that, like, the nightmare is coming after us. We don't want to have this thing, and it's going to show up. And why would this happen? Why would my psyche be doing this? It feels like it's a punishment or something, as opposed to, I'd say, a dream. But I see it as actually just the forcefulness of this unconscious part. It's like the way that we are operating now is just not sustainable anymore. Something needs to change in this repression landscape, is kind of a way I think of it. Something needs to shift, and it is just a rising anxiety that manages in the state of sleep for some reason to finally be able to break through, probably because we are captured. You know, we are there lying down, paralyzed. You know, we are in a captured state, and finally this part of our unconscious is going to have its say, and it's going to make sure we listen. And you know, it doesn't, maybe its message is pretty hard to decipher for many of us. But yeah, that's how I see it. I do want to distinguish that, though, from something that would be more like a traumatic flashback. There is definitely a gray area in between. I don't want to make it sound like they're two totally separate things. And you know, there's something to be said for just an emotional flashback as well, and how that might be intertwined with a nightmare. But yeah, I do think that there is something that looks more like a traumatic flashback, which is separate to that, and which is probably using similar pathways in the brain but it's doing something else. Something else is going on there. But a nightmare proper, if we can call it that, to me, yeah, that being chased thing that happens for a lot of people, and the being under attack. I'm just really curious how much of that may reflect, you know, in a general sense, as a society, our huge repression of aggressive impulses and everything that comes with it. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. Have I got anything here in my notes? No. Something else too that came to mind as I was speaking there just briefly was, I do remember too, in that nightmare, sometimes the way that I would try and deal with it was when it was happening, or even when I was anticipating the nightmare might come, I would think to myself, well, I just need to let it happen, and it's just like and not resist it, and then it will be like, there was this whole kind of way that I was still continuing to play out the idea that I should just be open to this kind of dynamic. And you know, in a roundabout way, it was my openness to the experience that actually led to the transformation. But it also engenders this whole idea of doing the opposite of what I think the dream is actually inviting me to do or to look at, which is to finally take more control. And realize that I can also step into the other shoes and all of that. But I am wary of time. I have clients today, but I just wanted to throw that in.
Extraordinary. Absolutely magnificent. Thank you, Aspasia. I think you pointed to a lot that is extremely important. You know, obviously someone like Freud said that the problem of civilization was toward the end of his career, it's more aggression than just sex, right? That aggression is kind of a primary issue. But society has dealt by aggression by repressing it. We have not created mechanisms of, dare I say, sublimating it, right? But you see, this is really important because if anger actually is, as we've talked about at the neck, deeper as precisely themos, or the power that leads to some fullness of the human being, if we do not sublimate it, we're in trouble, right? And it seems to lead to all sorts of issues. I think it is also quite profound to link it with dreams and how perhaps there is something about anger and dreams. Dreams come through, and maybe the language of anger can be dreams, especially when we understand anger as this deeper, possibly sublimatable energy. I think also you're pointing at, do we believe that the body is for us? If we believe it is for us, then if we're having a nightmare, it is somehow for us. If we have a pain in the arm, it is somehow for us. We tend to think that the body is random. We think that the brain is logical and sequential, but as Seth tells us, the whole body thinks, right? Well, if that's the case, then what the body does has a certain reason, right? We tend to assume if we feel pain, like I think it's really important to think of the brain and the body as primarily coordinating mechanisms. You know, we tend to go, pain is bad, not pain is good. But what if pain is a coordination? Likewise, it's actually trying to coordinate you differently, right? Like and I think that's the geometrical way to think of the body versus algebraic, right? Like all these things are a certain coordinating. I was speaking with Ross Bird yesterday, and in one of his pieces, he talks about the structure of, say, God is often, say in the Torah, unveiling in holiness. Like if God unveils himself entirely, he kills you. But if he doesn't unveil himself at all, you can't be led to holiness. So there's always this tension of availing enough so that you can be made holy, but not so much so that it doesn't destroy you. And it's true, the whole logic of, you could say that the Torah, Christianity has a certain unveiling structure to it, right? And the prophets are a certain unveiling, right? It's very interesting because it's almost as if the entire body is constantly doing that to itself, unveiling things to itself. Like if the nightmare doesn't happen, you can't be made holy per se, right? There would be a certain cruelty and not letting you have the nightmare, right? Because then you couldn't face this thing and unlock a power, right? But then you have to interpret the nightmare not as a random happenstance that's toil for toil's sake, but located in the logic of, dare I say, unveiling in holiness, as Ross Bird would put it, or Beatrice in beauty, right? These things are happening to lead you somewhere. But that's an idea where ideas matter, because if you don't have the idea that these things are leading you somewhere, or that these things are saying something, then you would just interpret them as random, and so you would be forever under the you would logically assume they were a curse because they never bore fruit. So from your experience, they were random. That's the problem with the human being. If you misinterpret something, it can be truth. And so if you never get the framework to understand the nightmare is possibly leading you to more holiness, quote unquote, or overcoming this repression, then you will live your life as if it is not, and thus relative to you, it is not, and you are right. And of course, damnation is being right in the wrong way, of course, locking one within the inside. But I think we just don't, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber, Sam, and Michael. We just don't have a society that thinks the body is for us. We don't believe emotions are for us. We think that they are in the way of rationality. When really, I associate dreams, emotions with the non-rational, and the non-rational is that of which makes the rational possible. The rational is always unfolding relative to the truth that it believes is the case, ergo the non-rational. And we actually arrive at these things according to things like dreams and so on and so forth. And basically also, if we associate dreams with art, with visions, there's something like Lacan talks about Joyce using his writing to kind of come to terms with his psychosis. I think the artistic act also can bring out repressions you need to face. The dream can bring out repressions you need to face. All thought that flows in a way that is more dreamlike versus syllogistic can lead you to the thing that you need to face to be more quote unquote holy, or to be more fully human, right? And the problem is, if we have a society that does not make space for dreams or creative acts or conversations that don't have a definite end and can flow in a sort of voicecraft way, then we cannot confront the things that we need to face, that if we don't face that, we can't be fully human. And basically, I guess I was also thinking as you were speaking, there's a way in which you turn yourself into your own literature. You start like literature has this kind of structure, and we all have to do things to turn ourselves into our own literature. And literature has to be interpreted and worked through. Literature is not melodrama. It doesn't tell you right or wrong, right? So all of us have to find somewhere in our lives to engage in the practices or the unfolding of thought so that we can, in a sense, be our own literature or literature to ourselves, because that's where we're going to find or locate through a working out and wrestling with the thing that is holding us back, that if we knew it was holding us back, we would have already done it. Oh, and the problem is the greatest repressions are those of which you think the mechanism of the repression is what you think is right to do. Like it wouldn't be a problem if the mechanism of the repression was something you thought was wrong to do, because you would stop it, right? It has to be, oh, passivity is holy here. I should let it just happen to me, right? This is where Michelle and I will say, like, basically the problems of life, the deepest problems of life are always ironies, where you do X for Y and X is why you don't get Y, right? And the psyche eventually arrives at an irony, which then links to Mr. Luber's work, because I think often the causer is unveiling the irony that then forces an absolute choice. There is more to say, but I will give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
What a pass off. Thank you. This is really, really good. Okay. So I think I'll start with Michael's question about storytelling and therapy, because I think this relates to, for me, sorry, I'm walking dogs right now, so I got a little distracted for a second. Forgive me. You can, once you're aware, okay. In the midst of your own contradiction, when you get to the place where you understand how you are the individual that you are as it relates to that contradiction, when you understand, okay, I am I, based off of the light and darkness in which I have traveled to. Once you understand that, then what? Like, that is to me the question, because philosophy is not going to help you, and more therapy won't help you at that point, because to me, what therapy is doing is similar to what a tutor does to a student that doesn't know how to read yet. Like, once you know how to read for yourself, like, sure, you could be part of reading groups, and there's like, oh, we're going to do this Lacan group of this text because it's difficult. It's a difficult read, but you could still read it yourself. You could still have your own, like, hermeneutic. The question is, from a therapy standpoint, you're going to therapy because you don't have a method or an approach to even get to your own understanding about yourself. Like, it's like, oh, I have these issues and you need help reading yourself. That's essentially what it is. Like, once, and feel free to push back. I'm no expert on therapy. I've definitely read a little bit about it, fair share, but feel free to push back. I think what the beauty of storytelling, and specifically focusing, and like, I just find it's like so important to me, but specifically focusing on theme actually helps situate how you even approach your individual light and dark, and how you realize yourself in relation to the deep rooted contradiction in which you're embedded in, which is akin to like how a main character in a story, why that main character is that main character as it relates to the operation of the story. It's the same thing. Like, you are who you are as it relates to the contradiction in which you realize within yourself. So with that being said, it's once you have that way of reading, like, once you have that way of reading, you then have to be able to extend that into the world. That is the question. How do you do that? What does that even mean? I'm not even sure. But like, I do think the buck, it just starts. Like, you go on this like philosophical journey of sorts. I think everybody does to a certain extent. And then you realize, there's this contradiction, but you don't really know how to read it, and it's affecting you as an individual. So now, once you kind of, for whatever reason, trauma, experience itself, or just through thinking, once you realize there's this contradiction, how do you read it as it relates to yourself? that's where therapy comes in. But then this is where like storytelling, the split of, this is where like the causer is the split within the contradiction that makes you realize who you even are. And like, that's when, if you are able to, like, isomorphically, if you're able to extend that out into every other aspect of what you do. So it's like, oh, I dog walk. I have a relationship to dog walking. In the midst of that relationship, there is a contradiction, which is how I realize myself within this relationship. And if I can understand the causer, basically the way in which the theme throws me into that relationship, then I'll be able to have a more, I don't want to say like intelligible, but a more like harmonious relationship to that. And like, that doesn't mean that maybe I struggle at times and I like go to a AA dog walking group, let's say. Those are all fine. And I think it's fine to get help with reading, especially when the reading becomes complex. But I think we're at a point in society where we can't even read well on our own. Like, that's what the problem is. That's why like if you don't, like, people, how do I say this? Okay. If the question is, okay, we institute therapy, we institute these like AA like things, we make it known that it's okay to talk to other people, okay? Everybody conforms to that. Everybody learns how to read themselves and read with others. Then what? Like, that to me is the question of game B. Because whatever future thing is going to happen is always going to be in relation to how well we can read ourselves amongst the contradictions. How the causer, how the main character, how the operation of the theme basically splits into needing a main character, i.e. you as an individual, let's say, how that comes into being is all related to how you read. And like, that's why I really like Heidegger has this quote where it's like, I could tell you who you are based on how you read. That's what he means. Like, it's not like reading and just like a simple reading a book, but it's like, the question is like, what is reading? Like, it's how you're even understanding the contradiction in which the book, in Heidegger's case, in which the book resides in. So like, that to me is the importance between storytelling and therapy right there, because storytelling is that next step where it's the logic, it's the language. And Bard, if you're listening to this, there definitely is a meta language, and that meta language is right here, is the following, is how your feedback relates to that baseline reveal state that I talked about earlier, and how you understand how it relates. Because once you understand that, then you can read with other people. Because as long as those other people also themselves can understand that relation, then what you're dealing with is something that is a language base. It's language based and it's meta. It's a meta language by nature. That's what storytelling is. And I think post-therapy, in the world of post-therapy, is the world of storytelling and convincing other. It's going to be a state of like some type of like convincing, a way of convincing how one comports their attention. And I think we're kind of on that wave now, but we're on that wave in like a bad faith sense, in like a we don't actually read well, and yet we're doing that. Like, we kind of skipped a step. If that makes sense. But yeah, there's a lot of good things said. I'm kind of forgetting the other stuff that I was thinking. So with that being said, I will pass it off.
Very important. So, and I'll pass it to Sam, Michael, and Jason. All right. So what you just said about the split, okay? So the contradiction has a split in which you can, in a sense, find yourself, if you grant me that, right? But that split is also a space that does not have givens by definition, right? And this is the problem that you're getting at. What now? What do you do now? So you go through the therapy, you have the story, but now you're in the split, if you will, right? This is where the absolute choice has to be made, right? But then, of course, there is the problem of what choice do you make that is its own grounding, and why make X instead of Y if by definition it is the absolute? If you could choose any feedback, loop, right? Why choose X instead of Y? Why leave them? If I'm using the word metaxis wrong, scream at me. If you're in the metaxis, the between space, the clearing in a Heideggerian sense, what is the proper absolute choice? So this, for me, this gets into the address of belonging again. Basically, the absolute choice that would not fall, Mr. Luber.
That was really well framed. I just want to jump in for a second with that. So this is where I want to call it like a meta ontology. Like this Matt Tux, I can't pronounce his thing, but basically it's you having the absolute choice, you picking a certain ontological mode and making sure it relates to the baseline reveal, and that relation to the baseline reveal is how it's like meta, how the meta part infuses with the ontology. So like it's not just simply having the absolute choice. It's having the absolute choice as it relates to it needing like that ontology, that specific ontological dimension that you choose. That dimension has to be needed for the baseline reveal to even be the baseline reveal. That's like the trick. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in.
No, so the answer to the mystics is the answer that people of many religious traditions, in my opinion, would say is the following: in the split, fall to your knees and wait. The absolute choice is to stay in the split, and you do it by falling into your knees. And if you believe the letting, yes. And here's the trick: do you believe that your body thinks? Do you believe that beauty exists and can strike through? Because then all you need to do is wait, and your body will actually move you. And the tree is that then in choosing to let your body carry you, just like the dream does, there is a way in which you're making the absolute choice beyond the horizon of your choice and giving it to a part of you that is actually a kind of knowing that cannot be reduced to simply choosing a feedback loop and thus falling into the same meta feedback loop, ultimately, of just coming back over and over into the split, right? In my opinion, many of the great religious, the greatest often say what you need to do is fall to your knees now. Right there in the split, just fall to your knees and let your body take over, basically. Or let the beauty strike you and stay there. The absolute choice, in a sense, is to move to the absolute situation of one's knees. This is something like an Anselm will put forth, a Master Eckhart, the letting and the clearing and different forth. And all you have to do is believe, and this is where it does move into something religious, all you have to believe is that your body actually does think. That there are processes in operation within you, that there is a world that works on you, and there is something that is a beauty that can strike through you, that the probability, here's the other claim that I would make, the likelihood of a strike of beauty increases substantially if you fall to your knees in that split. And if you then fall to your knees in that split and have the strike of beauty, then you can actually get in a feedback loop with the beauty, as opposed to a feedback loop that continually brings you back to the place of making the absolute choice. But the only reason you would fall to your knees, in a sense, the final absolute choice, as Jockin and I have spoken about, is actually the question, is lack nothing or is lack not nothing? Because if you fall to your knees in the split, which seems like it's nothing, but there is no nothing, there's only lack, then actually you've conditioned yourself in a certain metaphysical zone of which the possibility of the strike of beauty comes forth, and the possibility of the full attunement of your being, your body, so forth, to those higher aspirations increase. And so there's a way in which I think the ultimate literature ultimately leads a character to a place where they in the absolute choice, in the split, but in the metaxis of the feedback loops, they make the absolute choice for the absolute situation and embrace, or fall to their knees, or fall into a posture of letting. And in that vulnerability of not making a choice, the possibilities of the full human being can blossom outside the power of simply a choice architecture that is egotistical. But let me give it to Miss Sam Willem. Miss Willem, it's a delight.
Hi, also such a pleasure to be here. I'm really glad that actually I'll be following up your comments right now, because I think I would just like to sort of emphasize them and maybe just do so in a different vocabulary. Yeah, I think I began my intellectual journey kind of with Jung, and it was very dream work based. And it really sparked a question in me of like, but why do we dream? And I think that's been like intrinsically motivating curiosity for me a lot through a lot of my just intellectual life. And lately, I guess I've been more informed by, most recently by Thomas Moynihan's book, Spinal Catastrophism. And I think after reading his book, I came away with this thought that like waking is consciousness, like waking life is consciousness's experience of remembering, and that dreaming is sort of a metabolic process of forgetting time down into the body, and that you get this dichotomy of like, the waking world being sort of structured primarily by language and things that can be named. And we have this apophatic tradition which talks about God as something which doesn't actually have a name. It's just for our sakes that we would try to name him. And that there's, in many other cultures, there's this idea that like dreaming gives one access to spirit realms or to communication with different like animal masters, or, like even in the Jungian tradition, we have this idea that we're able to commune with our own unconscious, or with the collective unconscious, like a deeper communicative spirit through dreams. And I think Jung, he's a part of the Western tradition, and I think a lot of the Western tradition likes to think of dreams as bringing something unknown into the known. But I think what Thomas Moynihan does a really good job of, and I think is more so a less of a Western idea, is this idea that you can bring things from the waking world into the dream world through different disciplines and practices, and that's how you hunt, that's how you go into right relation with a herd of caribou, so as to like have a reciprocity with the world, and not just with the language world, the ensymboled world, and the language understandable, like the thing that can be placed, the closure of the world which can be enclosed in language. There's like more to it than just that, and the ways that, and a major like technique of living beyond just that enclosure is through dreaming. And I think it's really important. I think, not just to read your dreams, but likewise to like dream into your dreams. And I think that brings things down into the body. There's a sort of like an auger, like an experiential auger between like, sorry, I'm really going into the outer reaches of my own speculative thoughts. I'm not being super articulate, but like, I think there's a kind of spiral between like knowing and recognizing, and you really need things to be latent in your body in order for you to recognize them. And that happens a lot with like fiction. That's kind of, again, to just extend what you're saying, Daniel, like when you see a really good piece of fiction, you may not have the sort of named knowing of something, and maybe it might be that you're really on the precipice, and no human yet has had a named recognition of whatever is going on in a piece or in a experience or something. And so like you need things to go down into the body, so that when you're confronted with a new possibility, you're able to sense and recognize it. Like often thoughts begin as just like a felt sense, and I think that's a sort of has a spiraling dynamic, sort of like of bringing things from dreams into known like articulatable waking states, and then bringing waking states down and waking intentions down into just felt, bodied, you know, the forgetting of time. And that those two things work sort of like like, I don't know, like in the opposite direction but simultaneously. Yeah.
I think that's magnificent. I love that language of recognition, knowing, because there's a way in which if you didn't have a function of recognition, you would be consumed by a calculation problem. You would have to calculate everything to know it, and you'd be incredibly limited by energy, right? Like, we actually don't realize how much we are reliant on apprehension before we try to understand it. And there's something about dreams and that is actually a revelation of that. And actually, what you're speaking about, bringing things of the waking life into the dream life, I think that is completely true. And I do associate that with how many like people who are inventing something, if they come to a problem, they intentionally go to bed, knowing that bringing that to the realm where they can recognize the solution and then go back. Like the best inventors, or you could say literary geniuses, they have a sense, even if they can't articulate it, that when they reach the limits of their calculation or their knowing, the key is to then flip over to a place where recognition is possible and then recalculate again, right? But there's this need of trying to understand things is necessary to have things come together into a new form that you recognize. Like I think of forms here because there's something about recognition that perhaps can be tied to the form, whereas, knowing is precisely maybe the gathering of material for the possibility of a recognition of a form, right? Like you gather all of these ideas, and then when you sleep, the novel comes, right? Like the formation occurs as a recognition, right? And again, you could associate that with the no knowledge proof, but there's this movement of thought from understanding to recognition, and then that's more of a kind of letting in the Heideggerian sense. I will give it to Michael, and that actually brings to mind another way to frame some of the things we're saying. You go through the process of the story, like Luber is saying, first you learn to read. Then you go through the work of coming to the storytelling to come to the place of the absolute choice. And to me, the absolute choice is the place where you transition. I'll use this language, where you move to absolute letting. The only way you can move to absolute letting on your knees in the crack, which is the mystic, the religious, the art, etc., so forth. The only way there is anything to let, though, is because you did the work of storytelling and calculating, and thus there are things in you that you can let, right? And so there's a certain letting that occurs there. But then the interesting thing is the letting is what may bring you into your new story or feedback loop. But the quality of this story is a result of letting, as opposed to like the calls. It's almost like in that space, perhaps the causer becomes a kind of letting, to use Mr. Luber's language. It becomes something you let, which then brings you into a story that then brings you actually back to the place where then maybe you make an absolute choice, which then you work back to the place of an absolute letting, then back to the place of an absolute choice, on, and every single return is actually a sublation to a different quality that brings with it new possibilities. And then we're seeing a certain relationship, you could say, between the true, the good, and the beautiful, between the letting and the choice, and how the point of choice is to get to the place of letting, and the point of letting is to bring you back to the choice of a new quality, which then brings you back to the place of letting at a new quality, on and on and on. And because beauty is infinite, it can ever qualitize according to higher dimensionality. And so perhaps a way to word this is the movement from dare I say, you could say the therapy, the reading, to the storytelling, to the absolute choice, to the absolute letting, that then works from a different dimension on the same metageometrical structure, back to a place of absolute choice by a different quality, on and on and on. But this is only possible if you believe the body thinks. Because in letting, you have to let the body do it. In the letting, you have to let the otherness do it. The beauty, other beauty or other, right? The absolute letting on your knees is the place where you, in a sense, give vulnerably the push into the next story to otherness. And that's where then the quality of that story is in terms of absolute letting, which brings you to a choice, and on and on. And I think that gives you a metageometrical structure that can lead to something more negantropic. But let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please.
Yeah, so this, like, well, first of all, this has all been so helpful. So thank you all for humoring me for this long about this topic. It's been great. This whole, like, kind of bringing wakefulness into your dreams, and kind of the, like Sam just said something really beautiful, like braiding will into surrender, like the apophatic. It makes me think, I was last summer I was working at Grand Tetons National Park in Wyoming, and throughout the summer there, they had this series where each week they brought different indigenous artists from the tribes that were historically represented in the park, to do like week-long residencies where you could like interact with them, watch them oftentimes do their art. It was a really cool experience. And there was this woman who I encountered one day, and I ended up buying a couple pieces of her art. And she was drawing something or painting something for a friend that I think was going through cancer or like a terminal illness. And she was like, she said something that just stuck with me. She was like, I'm not painting this, like it's being painted for me. Like, and there was just this almost like this sense that there was some entity or some spirit or however you want to describe it that was beyond her, that was just, you know, kind of just taking over. And they're like, I was just watching her, and it was like she never picked up her brush. Like it was just like continuous, just like flowing out of her, this artistic expression. And it was like really, I mean, you could feel the kind of magic of that, just being in the presence of it. And so that yeah, that just kind of made, that was just kind of an example of that, of like just a feeling of being in wakefulness and kind of you know, like kind of just being drawn out of yourself. And it's not really something you can put into words. It's like, it's almost, when you try and think about what's happening, it kind of takes you out of it, because you know what we've been talking about is like these emotions, they, you know, they live in the body, and as soon as you kind of try and rationalize it or make sense of it, you're kind of taking yourself out of the moment. Yeah. And there's also kind of all this around, you know, like what you said, Daniel, like dreams of the revelation that the mind is limitless, you know, that they unveil the power of the brain. I think that's so spot on. That's so, yeah, that's exactly my sense of it as well. And then, you know, kind of where rationality comes in and kind of tries to, like, what we've essentially done with dreams is we've like compartmentalized them to this realm of the unconscious that is irrelevant to the waking life. And, you know, there's like, you know, so often people who want to talk about their dreams, they get dismissed, or, you know, kind of, I think a lot of people have this perception that like, because, or what people think is that we don't have any agency over our dreams, that because they perceive that we don't have any agency, it's irrelevant, because it's like, if this is just something that's kind of just happening beyond what we can understand or quantify or study, maybe, even though there's people who do study dreams, like, then like what's the relevance? And I think that doesn't just have repercussions for us understanding our dreams. It's like, then that kind of just diffuses into all the phenomena that occur in waking life that also are kind of extra, like, I want to say like extraterrestrial, but like you know, just those phenomena that are kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like something you can't put into words. I can't put in. Yes, ineffable. Thank you. I couldn't find the words to describe the word that talks about not having any. Like anything ineffable, like, then becomes something that isn't worth attention. And so much of phenomena that are ineffable are things that like have deep communicative power and like deep wisdom. And so, we're like distancing ourselves from our body, from our spiritual world, from this like internal psychological landscape. And I think one thing that I was talking about earlier with dreams and how they seem so elusive, and they seem kind of like the moment you kind of try and put a spotlight on them, they kind of like, they almost move. I think that's what great stories do. Is it like it's a call, to action, and it's like a call to inspiration, but it's not something that can be like totally known. Like, Daniel, I heard you, I think this was a video you did recently where you're talking about, or maybe this was in the net last week, where you're talking about one of Faulkner's books, and like the brilliance of it being like the main character doesn't have their own section, and so you're constantly thinking about it, and like wondering like what happened to this character. But in Faulkner's genius, he doesn't give you a clear answer, and so it's like it compels the mystery and compels self-inquiry into that. And yeah, and then last thing, and I'll give it back, just like the connection to therapy and storytelling. And Andrew put something in the chat of like, like it less being about like, or at least from what I understand from what he said, you can feel free to correct me, like it's less that like the goal is to live in like a post therapy age, but maybe more about a post like local consciousness on the self age, where therapy, as I see it, is really the beginning of wisdom cultivation, of discernment, of like in kind of the storytelling framework, like what story, given all the combinatorially explosive amount of narratives that I've picked up consciously and unconsciously from parents, from peers, from society, what out of those are the stories that are like really, really true? Because I don't think any of those stories are false. I just think that there are ones that are more true than others. And I think that's a lot of what therapy is like, kind of really delving into that and kind of getting like starting that journey like downwards. And then I think the next step from that is like, once you've connected with your story, start to tell it, but like not just from the framework of like, here's my story, like here's Michael's journey, but like the kind of idea of like the most personal is the most universal. So to like universalize your story so that it has the maximum like amount of reach, and it starts to embed you in community, and like starts to like, your locus of attention is now not like from this like hyper self-consciousness, but it's like it extends beyond you. But there's so much that was said that I think is brilliant. And what you were talking, what Aspasia was talking about earlier with things like anger, and how like we live in a society that represses anger, and then that brings in Owen's book, which I've been reading, Defenseology, and kind of like how to recover that. I think that work is really great, but there's too much to be said, so I'll pass it back.
Magnificent. No, I think you're exactly right on this kind of othering of, there's not will, where rationality, I think there's a certain imperialism that rationality commits against the body or dreams. If you don't control it, if it's not intelligible, the same with art, therefore it's exiled, it's othered, and it's kicked out. And also, so there's a certain like incentive for rationality to other things like dreams, et cetera, so forth, because then it becomes God, it becomes all powerful, right? But unfortunately, it becomes the God of algebra and flattening. And I think also basically, and then I'll give it to Jason, Mr. Jockin, and Mr. Luber, is that basically there's a very real sense in which if you don't go through therapy or psychoanalysis or some sort of process of coming to terms with yourself, philosophy is stuck in algebra per se. It can never become geometric. It can never become observing something beyond itself. You could be incredibly brilliant, but it will be flat. It cannot be fully human, right? It cannot be brought into higher dimensionalities. There's some, and I do think this is why so much of modern philosophy is arriving on things like psychoanalysis or the body or the subject, because there's a realization of the Enlightenment project failed, and yet why did it fail? Because it seems necessary. Oh, maybe it just wasn't dimensioned enough. Maybe it was too flat. Maybe it didn't come to the terms of the full human being, right? Like, it's one thing to talk about enlightenment if humans are a brain on a stick. It's another matter to talk about enlightenment if the whole body thinks, right? And is fundamentally relational and is fundamentally working toward beauty, right? So there's a sense in which our concept of enlightenment is low dimension, right? And that's why the project leads to, of course, totalitarianism, as Horkheim and Adorno talks about, or nihilism, or the meaning crisis, et cetera, so forth. But then, of course, the question, well, let's just throw away the Enlightenment, right? Then it was all bad. Well, in a sense, but it's really, it was not, of course, the Hegelian term would be sublated to a higher dimensionality, right? We are yet, there's a funny sense in which we're actually yet to be enlightened. We've just been enlightened in our syllogisms, but we actually haven't been enlightened as human beings, right? And it just turns out to be the case that the only way to take that road is something like therapy or emotional intelligence or relationships or things. And if we do not do that, whatever enlightenment we may get may simply be shining a lamp on a floor. But let me give it to Jason. Lastly, I would also say, Tyler, before I forget, the split that was mentioned, I would associate with the Dosting. Which you have brought with Boothby and religion in your wonderful talk at Theory Underground. It is the Dosting, and that's the place where you move to absolute letting, because also, too, in the Dosting, you can let the other in the Dosting come over you, right? And that's the religious impulse to enter the zone of the Dosting and let otherness be other, which is, of course, dangerous. But the only ways to live are to confront danger, yes? But let me give it to Jason. Jason, it's a delight to see you, sir, and I hope you are doing well. Thank you for being here.
It's a delight to be here, too. I resonate very much with what you said, that we are yet to be enlightened. I think this is a very important point. Like, what is this? We are not unenlightened, right? But we're not enlightened yet, exactly. And I think this is a very important thing to think about as human beings. Someone discussed earlier, like the we tend to discount the relevance of the dream life to, into the waking life. We tend to not incorporate them as well, which is to say we have a fragmentary waking life. But, I think the reverse is equally true. I think there is this sense in which we tend to cut off our dream state, our waking, the problems of our immediate waking life into the dream state itself. And I think this is the general philosophical problem, is how do we know if we're not yet still dreaming? And this reminds me of the story in Freud of the child who goes, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" So the story, real quick, is there's a father whose child had died. He's been taking care of this child for days. So then finally he went to another room to lie down, but he left the door ajar so he can still see the child. And there's a bunch of tall candles that's lighting up the room. And then there is an old man there hired to pray or whatever. So the guy goes to the other room to sleep. After a couple hours, he dreams that the child makes an appearance next to him and goes, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" And the guy wakes up. Turns out the candles, there's a fire, and so on. And the guy fell asleep, etc., etc. So Freud's interpretation of this dream is that, well, the dream is there to ever so slightly prolong sleep. So the man doesn't just wake up immediately from the smoke inhalation, but he conjures up the child to be there because the dream is a form of wish fulfillment. And so the reward is more sleep because he's very tired. But Lacan had a very radical look at this, which is, and for him, it's not even the fire itself, but the message in the fire, which is the guilt of the father who. So I guess I didn't mention that the child had died from a fever or something. So the man wakes up because he cannot deal with the fundamental trauma of the guilt that he couldn't save his. He feel like he probably feels like he could do something about the child. But before I ramble on, is this the basic idea is that it's not as if we then wake up to wake up. For Lacan, we wake up to keep on dreaming, right? And the dream is this waking life itself that we do not encounter the fundamental trauma. And I think that's super important, you know, like we were talking earlier about the frustration of forgetting dreams and such. But yeah, the very way that we forget dreams, or the very way that we disavow dreams, is very important, right? Like, why do we forget certain things? Why can our mind, and through a kind of negative logic, we can kind of see that there is a void, right, that we avoid, you know. And Daniel, you said something very cool earlier, that the feeling of not being free, or the feeling of being free in waking life, that we have some kind of agency, and in the dream we sort of forget that we don't. But maybe this is another disavowal. Maybe there is something in our waking life where we disavow our kind of unfreedom, so to speak, like our fundamental unfreedom. You know, and so in waking life, we think that somebody mentioned meta language earlier, that we stepped out of the unknown of the unconscious, out of the unknown of language, out of the unknown of imagination and so on, into waking life. But what if that's not the case? That what if we merely step out from what we already know, but we don't want to encounter, which is that we are not really free, right? Like I think, and yet I think our freedom begins there, right? I think truly free will begins there, because with this encounter, I think it's fun, you know, feedback loops, all these other structures, but essentially from a free will perspective, I think it's an encounter with negative freedom. The idea that freedom is just, you know, what I can choose. It's like insofar that I choose, right? Freedom in so far as that I have choices in life. But that's, I think, living in capitalism, living in an increasingly marketized world, I think we realize that more choices is exactly unfreedom. And this is where we make radical choices, you know, right? I think this is where we truly then wake up, you know, as you said, Daniel, right? We're not enlightened yet. That's the point, you know. I think. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you so much. This has been excellent.
Well, you are excellent. That was absolutely magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin and Mr. Luber, and if then anyone has final things, I think that is absolutely fire, because you know there's that weird move in Hegel where freedom is found in identifying with determination, and actually then making determination necessity for freedom, right? And I do think there's something about the dream that there's this doubleness, right? When you dream and you're free, you sense a freedom that is not there, but then you can misidentify it as the freedom of choice, when really the dream actually is the condition of something pulling you along that if you identify with, ergo trust the body, trust the process, you find freedom in letting. And this is the key. This is, you know, for me, this is where the absolute choice is pure freedom as choice, because it's not a choice that can be brought into a rational calculus. It is a choice that you make for its own sake, right? So that's the supremacy of freedom of choice. But that's actually where if you choose the split itself, if you choose the Das Ding, you then actually sublate freedom into freedom in letting, which is weird, because you are letting the other come forth as a determination that you will now identify with, right? So the freedom of choice, in a sense, meta moves on itself to choose the absolute as its choice, which is the space between feedback loops that could only be arrived at through the therapy story, et cetera, so forth. And then in that very act actually sublates into absolute letting, which is then the possibility of actual freedom, which is freedom in. Otherwise, you are forever trapped between freedom from or freedom to in the Isaiah Berlin sense. Like you're trapped in that forever. But if you get to the place of the absolute choice, and you choose the absolute choice, you choose the absolute in the absolute choice, you then actually have the possibility of absolute letting. But this is fundamentally a kind, I want to say, well, I'll call it an alterological. This is fundamentally a kind of, well, transcendent choice. Now, you can make it religious, you can make it mystical or whatever, because you have to be saying this. This is why it's very risky. If you, in the absolute, so the absolute choice is the birdie and donkey thing that I talk about all the time, right? Where you have two equally piles of grain and the donkey starves because there's no rational reason to choose one or the other. The absolute choice would be where the donkey chooses A instead of B. There's no reason to, it just does, which of course borders on insanity, non-rationality, et cetera, so forth. Absolute letting is where the donkey says, I'm going to choose standing between these piles because I believe actually there will be an otherness that lets me into a choice. So what you're doing is instead of choosing a pile, you're choosing the space between the piles and then actually being an absolute letting. But that's really risky because what if nothing ever comes? Then you starve to death. What if nothing ever comes in that letting to compel you into a choice like beauty or the dusting or the other? You could die, right? That's one.
What's
please.
I'm very sorry, but this what if, I think that's the dream life, you know, right? This what if, and we get captured, right? I think in my life anyway, I am absolutely captured by the what ifs, you know, and this absolutely structures my daydreaming, you know. Anyway, I'll stop. Yeah.
No, that's brilliant because the ultimate choice, the courage is in facing the what if. That is the grounds of the courage. You say, yes, that could happen, but then I'll die. And that's basically what the quote unquote saint does. It's like, I'm going to get on my knees. And if I starve to death, I starve to death, right? But I'm not going to be controlled by what ifs. I'm not going to be controlled by hypotheticals, right? So the absolute choice is the birdie and donkey. The absolute letting is where the donkey believes that there's an otherness, beauty, a strike, a something that will come along, but it might not. But the donkey doesn't care. The donkey is courageous all the same. And I think that is then what compels us into a new story of a new quality ever on and ever on. That would be a way I word it. And I think what you said gets right at it. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and Mr. Lubin. Mr. Jockin, please.
Borrow to kind of pick up what you're talking about in your reply to me last time, just what you just said now. Isn't it kind of mode of ignorance? Like the way we would talk about this is like unknown unknowns. But another way I would actually posit that around is thinking something's impossible when it's actually possible, aka lack is nothing, right? So it's the same idea. Because the whole pretense of this, just to give context for anyone who doesn't know this whole dictum, this whole doctrine or position, is that something cannot come from nothing. Literally impossible. It's just not in the realm of possibility, right? But the point when we see lack, it actually isn't abounding as a possibility. Translate your language from your conversation with Michelle, Daniel. This is a hypothetical to probable movement. Something that's hypothetical could be the case, but that's the point. It's actually a kind of disease when it's actually in the domain of the impossible, but yet your mind's looping on it in the act of infinity. It can do that, and it's actually destroying you because you're acting on non-existence in that moment. That's what's causing destruction for yourself. I'm saying this because it's not like in the past. You know, it's very interesting because usually a kind of a model talking about liberalism or progressivism against conservatism, one of the strongest challenges of it is usually the critique is that the progressive will at least make the position, and I think they're very true about this, is that the status of what is impossible is not static. It does change over time. A very easy example was man flying. That was actually Aristotle says that. That's a wish, meaning a desired good that is impossible. Men cannot fly. By our nature, we cannot fly. But then it became possible, but not by mimetic imitation. Basically, when the attempt was trying to be done by that, it failed. Basically, aquacopter, or whatever they're called, basically planes that flap their wings, basically imitating birds. No, what it took was an operation of the intellect of transforming the operation of flight, the activity of flight, into two parts, propulsion and lift. They had to be separated, but in nature and animals, they're combined. So what I'm getting at here is that this, and this actually relates to, by the way, with this whole comments that the body thinks. Aristotle would agree. The modes of cleverness, quickness of apprehension, and finding fittedness. These are all operations of the body working with the mind. They're operating together. So I was pointing out that, what is interesting about dreams is that they are presenting in front of you realms of what could be impossibilities. That's what it's trying to do. And that conversion from impossibility to possible, that's the thing. That's kind of why dreams should not be dismissed outright. And in fact, that's kind of why that Martin Luther King language I've talked about before is actually a much more active state of what a dream is doing. It's actually presenting an entire realm of possibility that could be the case. So it's actually transforming something. And remember, I think everyone has to remember the historical context when Martin Luther was making that speech. Segregation now, segregation forever. Like to use that language, the kind of the speeches at that time. It really was the social norm expectation. This is how the South operates. This is how race relations operate. This was the norm. Slavery, as a basic example, that was the norm for civilization. And it wasn't just one civilization, it was many civilizations had it. Something had to happen that transformed something that was impossible to become possible. So that's generally, I think, a very interesting aspect of dreams, is that when we take this seriously, especially in the sphere of the symbolic, because that's what dreams also seem to have a very important aspect to play. They're operating on the symbolic. They're not just imitations. That's what I'm getting at. That's why I'm bringing this up. They're not just as what Jason just said. Like that's the example of the man seeing his son saying, "I'm burning." Yeah, it wasn't just his son burning. It was a symbolic sign for something else. And that's how reading always works. Reading is a general point. Luber brought it up. It's exactly that. These are all symbolic orders of relationship. So it seems to be, they summarize, that the symbolic reading of dreams as legitimate activity of transforming or working on the transformation of impossibilities to possible. And once that enters the domain, now it actually is legitimately a movement into choice. It actually is. Aristotle would agree with that, because now we're not making a wish that is just fanciful thought and pure absolute freedom in that sense of there's no restrictions on it. But that's the point. It's like that language doesn't work anymore when we talk about it this way. Very good. This is a very good conversation. Very interesting. All right, that's what I got.
Magnificent. I think bringing up the impossible is very well done. It makes me think of the great Levi Setstan and his disciple Benjamin Fontaine, who I think are extremely important. Basically, he said, without the impossible, society is doomed. And he also basically said, and this is Benjamin Fontaine, who I like to write on in the idea of game theory, is that basically he said the Enlightenment has to, and this is his own thought before really Adorno and Horkheimer and different things. He's like, a society without the sense of the impossible will end up in totalitarianism. It will end up in a totality, because the impossible is always that excess that cannot be brought into the calculus, and it makes totalitarianism impossible, or it fights against totalitarianism. So if you don't have the impossible and everything is possible, then it's possible to totalize the possible, and therefore you get tyranny. And I think, well, that's actually, even if we're not under a tyrannical government, we actually do that to ourselves if we don't let the body think or dream. If we don't give ourselves the impossible as a kind of grace, then we actually do become terrorists to ourselves. If everything is possible, we're doomed. We actually need the impossible, because when everything is possible, everything is defined by what is the case now. And if that's what's possible, then it's flat. The impossible is the vertical. And basically, I think also too on what you're saying is that, there is something where you could argue the entire world has been made by dreams, yes? The social imagination, invention, entrepreneurship, voyeurs has not dreams. In a very funny way, if you were to ask who has a better case, does rationality have a case that it made the world? Or does dreams have a better case that they made the world? Oh man, it's not even close. Dreams have made the world. And yet we tend to treat them like nothing. Dreams have created the modern world, not rationality. Rationality has only been effective to the degree that it has been employed as a certain servant to the dream. Dreams have made wealth. Dreams have made the world what it is. And dreams have opened the realm of possibility for human beings to be more human. And yet we then, as perhaps ungrateful children, treat our parents as if they did nothing for us. Rationality is a bit of a spoiled child, perhaps. And so we pay the price. And Mr. Jockin.
Just to jump in, I'm immediately thinking of our conversation about gratitude. Just
Yes.
on that note, we're always forgetting what we're dependent on.
100%. And rationality is not grateful for dreams. And so it's left to its own devices. And it turns out it doesn't have many devices at all. And I do think, like, basically, like, again, Dietrich Maclowski and Pop, we could go through. There's the solo residual in economics, et cetera, so forth. We actually are not taught how much the frickin' world is made by imagination and dreams. We are led to believe that it is technical. It is not. I think also with the what I would also say is basically, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber, and if anyone has final things, basically the idea with the birdie and donkey. And you're exactly right that lack is not nothing is a kind of impossibility. It is kind of erected. You know, the AB as a logical construct is always, for me, kind of speaking to an impossibility that is in the possible that makes it dynamic, right? Because how does A equal B? That's impossible. Well, it has to be a situation that is multidimensional. So therefore, possible versus impossible is a flattened understanding of the impossible that is reducing time to space. Because that's what you're saying, right? What is impossible in the past is not impossible at all. So what you're doing is when you make the impossible opposed to the possible, you are defining the possible by a moment, not by a history. And that's a mistake. So the donkey basically caught between two piles, you would say it's impossible for the donkey to not die unless it makes a choice. Is it not impossible? If all it does is let, it will die. It's impossible that it would be moved. Well, that is the choice that must be made so that the horizon of possibility expands to a greater height. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
Wow. Yeah. So, okay. To me, I want to like really just talk for a minute about like the heart of the matter. You pointed out it's the absolute situation, the absolute letting be. Okay, we got to this place where we now see how there's this call it this infinity of movement, and that the human being is charged with not only tracking this movement but participating in this movement and not impeding it. And game A is in essence impeding it. Game B is in essence tracking and acting in accordance to this movement, from what I understand. If that is the case, which I'll put my name on it, I think that is the case at the end of the day. Then the question is, how do we get from impeding the movement to acting in accordance to that movement? I am now going to defend rationality because I think rationality, this is where actually rationality comes in. This is like in the most true sense what rationality is being harmonious to the movement. And I think what happens is rationality gets to a place of self-effacing when it becomes static, essentially. And then ergo, it actually isn't rational anymore. I think rationality emerges in the encounter, to use, Daniel's term. So this is where I think, this is where, and I'm like selfishly wanting to talk about this, honestly, because I'm going to bring this up tomorrow with Jim, where it's like, right there is the importance of theme. Theme is the rationality of acting in accordance to that movement that we've described earlier. And that, when there is this technical, like, I do think life move, like the actual world moves via dreams. I agree with what everyone's saying, but at the same time, it only is positioned like that because we're actually in a game A static rationality, that we have to think that because we're coming at it from this position, we have to think that dreams move the reality. Where if we look at it as dreams are just a given, and we're actually participating with the dream, and in that sense, that if that's taken seriously, then how you approach it needs to be analyzed via like a thematic structure. Not saying like my take on theme is the only and absolute correct take, but like something of that sentiment with a logical, rational structure will need to take in place, or we're just going to keep oscillating to this point where it's like, okay, we have a game A, and then this prototype B emerges, and then that actually turns out to just be an extension of A. Not, it started as a prototype of B and as a possible sublation of A, but because there isn't this logic or this technical dimension that's been articulated well enough, it keeps ironically just falling back into game A. So what I struggle with, like I love these conversations, love the net, love philosophy, but my problem is how do I, and I keep coming, and I brought this up in nets before, it's like, how do we actually talk about, how do we have a discourse about the technicality of a thematic approach to this movement, where in that sense it's just like a different domain, and I'm not sure. Like I think we have to situate ourselves in a story, and in like in a good story, and by that I mean a story that's aware of how it's just in the flow of this motion, and it's not the motion itself, and that it actually is just a deviation of the story, so to speak. That it stems from the same that it stems from the movement of the causer, and that the movement of the causer isn't subjugated into just one particular story. Like, how do we then talk about other people's stories and the world story on a level of its thematic, like on a not a spectrum, but like on a thematic measure, a measure. How do we talk about it in terms of a measure? Kind of to like Jockin 2 weeks ago, like, it needs to have a measure. It's kind of useless. I really agree with that, and I think that's like the hardest part, and that's like the biggest challenge of the whole Dark Renaissance game B thing. It's not is it the institution or the individual? It's actually what language do we use? What is the logic and like the rationale that we use? And like, how do we actually how do we actually go about that? Like, in my mind, like I think I have like a good grip for it, like within the domain of like storytelling, but like it's hard. It's like it's very hard for me to bring that to a beyond that, even though in theory it should go beyond that. So yeah, if anyone has any suggestions, please call the hotline at blah blah blah. No, but yeah, I just think it's really interesting that we're actually we should be grateful that we're at a point where there's so much thinking, so much philosophy, so much history that's occurred, that we could get to the place of realizing the absolute situation, the absolute letting be, and we can actually understand its geometrical patterns, if you will. And now the question is, how do we participate that in an appropriate way? Like, I think that's like a magical spot that we're in, and it's like that participation in an appropriate way. Like, I think Husserl would argue that's science. Like, that right there is actually science. And it's just a shame that like science has kind of taken this deviation, or it kind of like turned left on that path a little bit. And now it's like kind of just called storytelling. But the problem with storytelling is that from a colloquial standpoint, like storytelling can just be complete bullshit. So it's just like from a colloquial standpoint, just that concept seems to like also veered right and really far away from that like really fertile ground in which it's actually supposed to be situated, whether you call it science or storytelling, but just that particular dimension. And I think that dimension is so fruitful, and the conversations and the debates that could come out of it could be so fruitful. Like, I'll just leave it with this. When I'm like writing with my writing partner, and there's like two of them now, there's three of us. When the three of us are writing, and we know basically we're all situated within that fertile ground, the debates and the back and forth is very challenging because everybody's right in a certain respect. It's the question becomes who's more thematic, and like being able to discern that is a challenge and a fun challenge, and it becomes a collective thing because you recognize how everybody's actually kind of right. And that's like a very weird place to be in, because typically, colloquially, when you're in a debate, there's a right and a wrong. But like when you're talking about, when you realize this dimension that I'm talking about, and you have other people that have also realized this dimension and are trying to like generate something, then you kind of see how it's like everyone's kind of right. Where do you go from there? How do you discern that? And that is, in my opinion, like the job of the storyteller, and just like having like the argument and the logical structure to support your position in that matter. And I think that is like, I'm constantly thinking, how do we have more of those conversations? And I think it starts with realizing this absolute letting be. But like once we get to that place, it's like, okay, now let's take action. And what does that entail? And how do we actually have discourse, and how do we communicate in relation to that? And yeah, that's I'll just leave it at that. And I love this conversation.
Well, we love you. Magnificent. Anyone have any final things to say on this fine evening? I've enjoyed it immensely. Delightful. Well, Mr. Luber, I think you've pointed out quite a lot that is extremely important. The logic I would associate with the modern counter-enlightenment. I would associate the unfolding of that logic as an emphasis of philosophy portal. The material condition in which that logic would need to be realized economically, socially, and educationally is something that I think we emphasize or try to emphasize at Theory Underground. The art of what you are describing is what voicecraft is all about. And that is what that way of speaking and communicating is in the absolute letting can be associated with the project of Tim Adlin. And ultimately, all of this is orbited together by the beautiful, as Mr. Jockin will emphasize and work on. To use your language, things are themes of situations. There are not things, there are themes. And the reason why themes hold things together is because things are situational, following a metageometry of Leibniz. You could also talk Hegel and things like that. You are correct that rationality is precisely in the business of getting you to the place of the absolute choice, and very important. So the question is, what is the theme of rationality? I would say the theme of rationality is to let itself go. The theme of rationality is to identify with the person or the body or the dream that it cannot encompass, and to identify with that determination and thus find real freedom. The point of the theme of rationality, the command of rationality, the thematic command of rationality is do not let your rationality get in the way of your recognition. And rationality is in the business of getting in the way of recognition. And therefore, the point, the great story of rationality is to come to the place where it realizes its limitation, and in that humility chooses a commedia instead of a tragedy, which one could argue the Enlightenment is rationality choosing a tragedy as opposed to a commedia. But in order to choose a commedia, it has to be willing to be the donkey that doesn't choose anything and instead has the absolute letting, which is then a justified belief if one takes beauty seriously. I think basically what we are in, as you have described and as Voicecraft is modeled, We are in the time of the absolute situation, of which is only addressed by the absolute letting, of which requires that sort of interaction with one another that we do see in the storyteller, the one who sees difference, but it is not a difference that leads to killing, but a mutual co-mingling, dialogo, circling, whatever language we would like to figure out how to be the most thematic of that of which will let us be. And pluralism that is incapable of doing this will ultimately end up in, well, death. And so it is extremely important that we model that. And I think Voicecraft is the place that is doing that work, because we have to let the mystery of the very fact that rationality finds its freedom in identifying that of which it is not and yet is not destroyed. We have to let that unfold. And that is extremely difficult. But if we have people that are committed to that work, who have also conditioned themselves to have the courage to do that work, I do think there's hope. And always talking with you fine people bring me that hope. Thank you so much for the time. It has been a complete delight, and may you all have a tremendous day. Thank you so much. All the best.